there is a postcard that survived. It was written in pencil, in a careful hand, on the morning of April 11th, 1912. The writer was a young woman named Esther, travelling third class, bound for relatives in Pennsylvania. She had never been on a ship before. She had never, for that matter, been more than 30 miles from the village in County Cork where she was born. But on that bright spring morning, standing somewhere near the stern of the largest moving object ever constructed by human beings, she wrote a few lines home. She said the ship was the most enormous thing she had ever seen in her life. She said the sea was very blue and very calm. She said she had eaten a meal in a proper dining room with white tablecloths, and that it felt strange, like something that belonged to another person's life. She said she was not afraid. That postcard was never received. It went down with the ship 3 days later, or perhaps was sorted from the recovered mail and lost in the years that followed. No one knows for certain. But it was found in 1987 among the personal effects recovered from the wreck site, sealed inside a tin that had somehow kept water out for 75 years. A young woman who had never seen the ocean, eating a meal with a white tablecloth, on her way to a new life. That is where this story begins, not with the iceberg, not with the captain, not with the men who built the ship or owned it or decided it was unsinkable. It begins with Esther, eating her meal and watching the Irish coastline disappear behind her, and feeling something so large and unfamiliar that she couldn't quite name it. She wasn't the only one. To understand what the Titanic meant, truly meant, not just as a catastrophe but as a dream, you have to understand the world that made her. And that world was one of almost intoxicating confidence. The year is 1912. The Edwardian era has just given way to the reign of George V, but the spirit of the age is still unmistakably Edwardian, optimistic, industrious, and possessed of a deep and largely unchallenged faith in the idea that the future will be better than the past. And that human ingenuity was the engine driving it there. The people who lived through this period, the first decade and a half of the 20th century, would later look back on it as a kind of golden afternoon, a long warm moment before everything changed. Though of course they didn't know, standing inside it, that it was about to change at all. Britain was still the centre of the world's most powerful empire. The sun famously did not set on it. 1 in 4 people on the planet lived under British rule, and the trade routes that connected those territories ran largely through British ports, on British ships. London was the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was the currency most trusted on international exchanges. And Belfast, where the Titanic was built, was one of the great industrial powerhouses of the British Isles, a city of shipyards and linen mills, of Protestant and Catholic neighbourhoods divided by tradition and suspicion, of men who worked with their hands and built things that lasted. It is worth pausing on Belfast, because Belfast is where this story actually starts, not on the water, in the yard. The Harland and Wolff shipyard sat along the eastern shore of Belfast Lough, a long, wide inlet of water that opens toward the Irish Sea. By the early years of the 20th century, it was one of the largest shipyards on Earth. You could smell it before you could see it, if the wind was coming in off the water. Iron filings, and coal smoke, and the hot mineral tang of molten metal. You could hear it from the other side of the city. The rhythmic hammering of thousands of riveters at work. A sound so constant and so deep that the people of Belfast absorbed it like a heartbeat. Children grew up with it in the background. Women hung their washing to it. Men timed their walks to work by its shifts. The yard employed tens of thousands of men at its peak. They were divided into castes as clear and rigid as any feudal hierarchy. At the top were the designers and naval architects, men with offices and drawing tables, who worked in pencil and ink and thought in 3 dimensions. Below them were the foremen, who translated those drawings into instructions. Then came the skilled tradesmen, platers, riveters, caulkers, joiners, electricians, and at the bottom, though they formed the backbone of everything, were the labourers, men who shifted iron and hauled rope and carried things from one place to another for 10 hours a day. The work was relentless and frequently dangerous. Men fell from scaffolding, burns were common, fingers were lost. The sound of the yard could damage hearing over years of exposure, though no one thought to mention that at the time. The men who worked there rarely complained about this, not because they were indifferent to their own welfare, but because employment in the yard was considered a form of security in an era when security was not easily come by. To have a berth at Harland and Wolff was to have a future. To be a riveter was to be someone. On a typical morning in 1911, a man named Thomas, one of thousands of men named Thomas working in the yard, would rise before 6, eat a breakfast of bread and dripping, pull on his working clothes, and walk to the yard in the grey half-light of early morning. He would pass through the great iron gates with hundreds of other men, most of them known to him, most of them neighbours or relatives or men who drank at the same public house. He would take his place at the hull of whichever ship was currently in progress. He would spend the next 10 hours driving iron rivets into iron plates, working in teams of 4, the rhythm of their hammers so practiced that it barely required thought. He would eat his midday meal, bread and cold tea, perhaps a piece of boiled mutton, sitting on a plank of wood near the hull. Then he would work until the evening whistle blew. On the walk home, he might stop to look at what they were building. And what they were building, from 1909 onward, was unlike anything that had been built before. The story of how Titanic came into being is, at its core, a story about competition. The two great powers of the North Atlantic passenger trade in the early 20th century were the White Star Line and the Cunard Line. Both were British. Both ran regular service between Southampton and New York, carrying the full spectrum of humanity that was moving between Europe and America. The wealthy in their first-class staterooms, the middle classes in second class, and the vast migrant tide of working people and peasants who occupied the lower decks in third class, pressed close together, heading west toward a different life. The competition between these two companies was not merely commercial. It was a matter of national prestige, of engineering pride, and of a particular Edwardian desire to demonstrate that Britain remained the unchallenged master of the seas. When Cunard launched the Mauretania and the Lusitania in 1906 and 1907, they set new records for Atlantic crossings. The ships were fast and modern and celebrated. They were the kind of ships that appeared in newspaper illustrations, under headlines about progress and the future. White Star's response was to think differently. Rather than compete on speed, they would compete on scale. Rather than try to build faster ships, they would build the most magnificent ships ever floated. Ships so large, so luxurious, so thoroughly considered in every detail that crossing the Atlantic in them would feel less like a transit and more like an event. The conversation that set this in motion is said to have taken place at a dinner party in the summer of 1907. The chairman of White Star, J. Bruce Ismay, was a guest at the London home of Lord William Pirrie, one of the controlling partners of Harland and Wolff. After dinner, the two men withdrew, as was the custom among men of that class and era, to a quieter room. Cigars were lit, whiskey was poured, and the idea was hatched. 3 ships, built in sequence, each approximately 46,000 gross tons, each approximately 269 metres long, each the largest vessel of her class in the world. They would call them Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic. The names alone tell you something about the state of mind that produced them. The plans were drawn in Belfast, in the design offices of Harland and Wolff, over the following months. The chief naval architect was a man named Thomas Andrews, who would later sail aboard Titanic as part of the builder's inspection team and would go down with the ship he helped create. By most accounts, Andrews was a man of exceptional gifts, methodical, imaginative, enormously knowledgeable, and possessed of the particular combination of technical precision and aesthetic sensibility that designing ships requires. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him, a genuinely kind man, the kind of man who noticed people, who remembered the names of workers on the floor of the yard, who took a personal interest in the comfort and safety of the ships he designed. The drawings he produced for Titanic were extraordinary documents. Every pipe run was annotated, every watertight compartment was specified, every staircase was drawn in elevation and plan. The first-class staircase, the grand staircase that would later become one of the most iconic spaces in maritime history, the one that every painting and film reconstruction has tried to recreate, was worked out in careful pencil lines, its proportions balanced, its ironwork detailed, its skylight calculated to fill the well of the stairs with natural light during the day. Andrews drew all of this knowing that most passengers would never see the blueprints. that the experience of the staircase would be wordless. A feeling of grandeur, a sense of arriving somewhere that matched the occasion. Design at its most effective is invisible. You don't notice that it's working. You simply feel different when you step into the space. He got it right. People who boarded Titanic and later survived wrote about that staircase with a kind of reverence. Not because they were told to be impressed, but because they were. Construction began on the Titanic in the spring of 1909, roughly 8 months after the Olympic. Her older sister had been laid down. The two ships were built in adjacent slipways under a massive gantry structure that towered over the Belfast skyline and was, for several years, the largest movable structure in the world. From certain angles, standing in the streets near the yard, you could see the hulls rising above the rooftops, a presence in the city so enormous that people stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a mountain. It was simply there. The keel was laid first, the spine of the ship, running from bow to stern. Then the frames, steel ribs that would give the hull its shape, bolted into place one by one, rising until the ship began to look like the skeleton of something enormous. Then the plating, steel plates, each weighing several tons, lifted by crane and pressed into position and riveted in place by the gangs of 4 men. A holder-up, a heater boy, a catcher, and the riveter himself, working at a pace that seems almost impossible to imagine from the outside. It took approximately 3 million rivets to hold Titanic together. 3 million. Driven by hand, each one heated in a small furnace until it glowed orange, caught in a bucket, placed in its hole, and hammered flat on the opposite side while still hot, cooling to lock the plates together as it hardened. The sound of this work was the sound of Belfast. It was the sound of modernity being assembled, plate by plate, rivet by rivet, on the banks of a lough in the northeast of Ireland. The men who drove those rivets were paid by the piece. A fast gang could drive between 200 and 300 rivets in a shift. A very fast gang might do more. The work required a kind of physical coordination that came only from years of practice. The heater boy had to read the colour of the iron accurately enough to know when it was ready. The catcher had to be fast enough to grab it from the air. The holder-up had to position the bucking iron perfectly, and the riveter had to bring the hammer down with exactly the right force. Not too hard, not too soft. Too soft and the rivet would be loose. Too hard and it might crack. Most of the time they got it right. Belfast in 1910 and 1911 was a city of complicated textures. It was prosperous in ways that many Irish cities were not. The industrial north had remained relatively insulated from the grinding rural poverty that characterised much of Ireland, and a working man with a good trade, a riveter, a spinner, a loom operator, could, with care and luck, provide a decent life for his family. Not a comfortable life by the standards of the people who would eventually travel first class aboard the ship being built in the yard, but decent. A house in a terrace, a coal fire in the grate, enough food on the table, children who went to school and came home with their clothes intact. The houses near the shipyard were small but well kept for the most part. 2 rooms up and 2 down, a scullery at the back, a small yard. The women of these houses managed economies of enormous complexity, stretching a week's wage across bread and coal and rent and shoes and the occasional luxury, organising the bathing of children in a tin bath before the kitchen fire, cooking on a range that needed to be fed and tended. Life ran on routine. Monday was washing day, Tuesday, the market. The rhythm of the week was as fixed as the rhythm of the tide. Religion divided the city in ways that were already old and would become older still. The Catholic neighbourhoods and the Protestant neighbourhoods were known and broadly respected as boundaries, though the yard itself employed workers of both traditions, and men who would not drink in the same public house would sometimes work alongside each other for decades, without serious incident. It was a city that had learned to hold its tensions in a kind of managed suspension, not resolved, not forgotten, but set aside in the practical business of daily life. Politics was thickening, though. The question of Irish Home Rule, whether Ireland should have a degree of self-governance or remain entirely under Westminster, was moving toward a crisis that would eventually tear the country apart. In the streets of Belfast, men argued about it in doorways and public houses. In the newspapers, the language was becoming harder. But in 1910, 1911, most people were still going to work. still eating their dinners, still putting their children to bed. The catastrophe was coming, but it wasn't here yet. Meanwhile, in the yard, the hull was rising. By the spring of 1911, Titanic was ready to be launched. The launch of a ship is not the completion of a ship. It is the moment the hull first meets the water. Nothing more than a bare steel shell, without engines, without fittings, without any of the interior spaces that will eventually make it what it is. But it is a moment of enormous symbolic weight, and the launch of Titanic drew a crowd of approximately 100,000 people to the banks of Belfast Lough on the morning of May 31st, 1911. They came by train and by foot and by tram. They brought children. They brought lunches wrapped in cloth. They stood on any elevated position that offered a view. Walls, cranes, the roofs of sheds. The air was cool and clear. The water in the Lough was still. At exactly 12:14 in the afternoon, the triggers were released. The hull, already weighing more than 24,000 tons, began to move. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, then faster, gathering momentum down the slipway, greased with 22 tons of tallow and soap, until it hit the water at speed and the crowd roared and the spray rose in great white sheets and the ship floated, free for the first time. It took 62 seconds from the moment the hull began to move to the moment it rested, still in the Lough. 62 seconds to launch the largest moving object in the world. The men who had built it watched from the yard. Some of them wept. Most of them had been working on the ship for 2 years by this point, had spent their working hours in the growing belly of it, learning its shapes and its dimensions and its weight in the way that you learn a place you inhabit. And now it was floating, which is the only thing a ship ultimately needs to do, and they had made it happen. Thomas Andrews was there. He watched the hull hit the water and said nothing that was recorded. The fitting out period, the months between launch and completion, was in many ways the most complicated part of building Titanic. The bare hull was towed to a specially constructed deep water wharf where the real work of creating the ship's interior could begin. This was a different kind of work from the hard physical labour of riveting and plating. It was the work of joiners and cabinet makers, of upholsterers and glaziers, of electricians running cables through the narrow passages between decks, of plumbers connecting miles of piping, of decorators applying plasterwork and paint and panelling to the walls of rooms that would eventually look less like the interior of a ship than like the interior of a fine London hotel. A first-class dining saloon could seat 532 people at once. Its walls were panelled in a Jacobean style, dark oak, carved with patterns based on Elizabethan originals, lit by great windows and by electric light fittings that cast a warm, even glow. The carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps. The tables were set with white star-lined china, heavy with the company's flag in red and white. The cutlery was silver-plated. The glasses were crystal. The first-class reading and writing room was designed to suggest a private club. Walls painted white, furniture in Georgian style, bookshelves arranged with volumes that might be genuinely read, rather than merely displayed. The smoking room, reserved for men, was done in darker tones, carved mahogany, stained glass, a fireplace with a genuine fire on cold evenings. The Turkish bath offered an anteroom, a cooling room, a hot room, a shampooing room, all tiled and columned and lit with ornate lanterns in a Moorish style, as if a small corner of Constantinople had been transported to the middle of the Atlantic. This last detail is worth dwelling on. The Turkish bath was a fairly recent amenity in large hotels and clubs. Its presence on a ship, even a ship of this scale, was a statement about the expectations of first-class passengers. They did not expect to be merely transported. They expected to be entertained, pampered, restored. The crossing took approximately 5 to 7 days, depending on weather and route. For the wealthy, those days were not to be merely endured. They were to be enjoyed. The gymnasium had bicycles fixed to the floor, exercise bicycles, the pedals spinning without going anywhere, which now seems like a perfect metaphor for something, though it's not entirely clear for what. There were rowing machines and an electric camel, a mechanical device that simulated the motion of riding a camel and was considered excellent for the liver. First-class passengers could book sessions with the gym instructor, a man who had been trained not just in physical exercise, but in the social management of wealthy clients. Even the swimming pool, one of the first on a transatlantic liner, was fitted with wooden changing cubicles, heated towel rails, and attendants stationed to provide whatever was required. Salt water was pumped in directly from the sea, at whatever depth the ship happened to be crossing. It was not a large pool by any standard, but it existed in the middle of the ocean, and that fact alone was considered extraordinary. The contrast with third class is so stark that it requires some care to describe accurately, because it is tempting to dramatize it, to make it into a simple story of luxury versus deprivation, wealth versus poverty. The reality is more interesting than that. Third-class accommodation on Titanic was, by the standards of transatlantic travel in 1912, genuinely better than what had come before. Earlier ships had transported migrants in open dormitories, barely partitioned, with minimal sanitation and communal feeding arrangements that resembled nothing so much as a large institutional canteen. The conditions had been the subject of reform campaigns for decades, and by 1912 there were regulations, from the American immigration authorities in particular, governing how many people could be carried per square foot, what sanitation facilities had to be provided, what food standards had to be met. Titanic met these requirements and exceeded them in several respects. Third-class cabins were enclosed, real rooms with berths for 2 to 6 people, not open dormitories. There were separate sleeping quarters for single men and for families. The dining room was a proper room with tables and benches, not a cafeteria line. The food was cooked to a standard that would have been unrecognizable to many of the passengers, some of whom had never eaten from a proper kitchen in their lives. The menus for third class on the day of the sinking included items like roast beef, rice soup, jacket potatoes, fresh bread, jam and tea. By the standards of what a farm labourer in Ireland or a villager in Sweden or a factory worker in Croatia ate at home, this was a meal of some substance, but the structure of the ship encoded the structure of the society that built it. Third-class passengers were confined to specific decks, specific areas. There were gates, physical metal gates with latches, that separated the third-class sections from the second and first. These were not secret arrangements or unofficial barriers. They were required by American immigration law, which stipulated that passengers needed to be held in segregated groups to facilitate health inspections at Ellis Island. The gates were regulatory. They were also a physical inscription of class hierarchy in iron and steel. The third-class passengers included families who had sold their furniture and their tools to raise the price of the ticket. Young men leaving behind everything they knew because there was no work at home. Women travelling alone to join husbands who had gone ahead 2 years before and were now, in letters written in pencil on thin paper, describing a life that sounded improbably possible. Children who had been told they were going somewhere better, and believed it because children tend to believe what they are told. There were 709 people travelling third class on Titanic. Of those, 174 survived. The survival rate for third-class passengers was approximately 24%. For first-class passengers, it was 60%. The gates that were required by immigration law were opened late during the evacuation. How late is a matter of historical dispute, but late enough that many third-class passengers did not reach the boat deck in time. This is a fact that requires no dramatization. On the morning of April 10, 1912, Titanic left Belfast for the last time. She had completed her sea trials in the waters of Belfast Lough and the North Channel. 2 days of testing engines, measuring speed, checking steering, testing the watertight doors that divided the hull into 16 compartments. The ship performed well. The engineers were satisfied. Thomas Andrews made notes in the small book he always carried, recording things that needed attention. Minor cabin adjustments, a reading lamp that wasn't quite right, a detail in the promenade that he wanted reviewed. He was constitutionally unable to consider anything finished. The ship steamed south and west along the Irish coast to Southampton, where she would embark her passengers. Southampton in April of 1912 was a city that ran on ships. The great ocean liners called there regularly: Mauretania, Lusitania, Olympic and now Titanic. The docks were the city's economy. The men who worked on the ships, the stewards, the firemen, the engineers, the junior officers, lived in streets within walking distance of the water. Their wives grew accustomed to months of absence, to letters from New York and back, to children who grew noticeably between their fathers' voyages. Southampton had recently suffered a blow. A coal strike had been ongoing and many of Titanic's intended crew had been temporarily unemployed. The Titanic voyage was, for many of them, not just a job but a relief, a return to income after weeks of uncertainty. It is this detail that makes the crew manifest something more than a list of names and positions. They were people who needed this voyage, who were glad it was happening. The passengers began to arrive at Southampton's White Star Dock on the morning of April 10th. First class came by boat train from London, Waterloo Station to Southampton Docks, in carriages that were reserved and comfortable, with luggage loaded separately by porters who moved with practiced efficiency. The wealthy passengers brought with them a quantity of luggage that is now difficult to imagine as practical rather than theatrical. Wardrobe trunks, massive rectangular cases, almost the size of a standing wardrobe, that open to reveal hanging space for a week's worth of evening gowns, day dresses, and accessories. Hat boxes, shoe boxes, jewelry cases, with fitted compartments lined in velvet. The wife of one American businessman was reported to have boarded with 17 pieces of luggage. This was not considered excessive. Among those boarding first class on that morning were names that would later be replayed endlessly in newspapers and public memory. John Jacob Astor IV, at that time possibly the wealthiest man in America, an heir to the Astor fortune, accompanied by his new young wife Madeline, who was 18 and 5 months pregnant. Astor was 47. The marriage had been a scandal. His divorce from his first wife had been extensively covered, and his remarriage to a woman younger than his own son had generated a level of public disapproval that had driven the couple to Europe for the winter, waiting for the fuss to die down. They were returning home, hoping that time had done its work. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining heir, was travelling with his valet and separately with his French mistress, a singer named Leontine Aubard, who travelled as Madame Aubard and was listed in the passenger manifest, without further explanation. This arrangement was not unusual among men of Guggenheim's class. What was unusual was what Guggenheim reportedly said later that night when it became clear the ship was sinking. But that is a story for its proper moment. Margaret Molly Brown, later mythologized in both a Broadway musical and a film and known even then as something of a character, boarded with the energy she brought to everything. Brown was from Colorado, self-made wealthy through her husband's mining interests, and was one of that category of American women who had accumulated money before they had accumulated the social credentials that money was supposed to buy. She was loud and warm and fiercely practical and entirely unconcerned with what people thought of her, which made her an object of gentle condescension from the more old-money first-class passengers and genuine affection from almost everyone else. These are the people whose names history has preserved. But for every name we know, there were dozens of people travelling first class whose names have faded. Businessmen returning from London meetings, couples on honeymoons, elderly women visiting family, men whose sole distinction was wealth and whose sole tragedy was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Second class on Titanic was, by many measures, the most interesting social space on the ship. Second-class passengers in 1912 occupied a complex position. They were not wealthy in the way first-class passengers were wealthy, but they were not migrant workers either. They were professionals, small business owners, teachers, ministers of religion, junior military officers, skilled artisans travelling with their families. They were people for whom the price of a second-class ticket was significant but manageable. Not a sacrifice, but a considered expenditure. The second-class library was well stocked. The second-class dining room was, this is genuinely remarkable, equipped and decorated to a standard that would have counted as first class on most other ships of the era. The food in second class was elaborate. 4-course dinners, multiple choices at each course, wine served from proper bottles. The cabins were enclosed and private, with actual furniture, not just bunks. Passengers could sit at small desks, look out through portholes, read by electric light. Among the second-class passengers was a man named Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher from London who was travelling to visit his brother in Canada. Beasley was a careful observer, a man trained by profession to notice detail and record it accurately. He survived. and the account he later wrote of the voyage and the sinking is one of the most precise and useful documents we have. Not because he was heroic, but because he was attentive. He noticed the texture of the ship, the way it moved in the water, the quality of the light in the evenings, the sounds of the engines through the hull, and then the strange silence when they stopped. He wrote that the voyage, up to the moment of the collision, had been extraordinarily pleasant, that the weather had been clear and cold, but not harsh, that the sea had been so calm it looked like a polished floor, that people had remarked on how smooth the crossing was, and that there had been a general air of contentment aboard, the particular contentment of people who are comfortable and have nowhere else to be. He was right about all of this. It was a smooth crossing. The sea was exceptionally calm. The weather had been, by North Atlantic standards in April, almost uncharacteristically good. The ship was running on schedule, making approximately 22 knots, and there was a sense, understood but not quite articulated, that the Titanic was performing as she should, that everything was going according to a plan that had been drawn up in offices in Belfast and London and Southampton, and that the plan was sound. The captain was Edward John Smith. He was 62 years old and had been at sea for over 40 years. He was one of the most experienced and respected ocean liner captains in the world. He had commanded the Majestic, the Baltic, the Adriatic, the Olympic. He was known among passengers as the millionaire's captain, a term of affection that described not his wealth but his social ease, the natural authority he projected in company, the way wealthy and distinguished passengers felt reassured by his presence. He was, by most accounts, a man who radiated calm. This was not a performance. It was the result of 40 years at sea, 40 years of weather, of mechanical failures, of difficult passages and awkward situations, and the 1,000 small crises that accumulate in a career of that length. He had learned, as experienced captains learn, that the worst thing a commander can do in uncertain circumstances is communicate uncertainty. A calm captain makes calm passengers. A calm ship is a ship that can be managed. Smith was planning to retire after this voyage. The Titanic was to be his last command, a ceremonial final crossing, a farewell to the sea that had defined his life. He had a wife at home in Southampton, a daughter he was fond of. He had said in an interview some years before that he could not imagine a modern ship failing catastrophically, given the equipment available and the experience that the industry had accumulated. He said it with the confidence of a man who genuinely believed it. He believed it right up until the moment it ceased to be true. The North Atlantic in April is a specific kind of place. If you have only seen it in films or in photographs taken from cruise ships, you have an idea of it as open space, grey or blue depending on the weather, enormous, slightly abstract. But the North Atlantic in April has a physical quality that those images don't quite capture. The cold is not just temperature, it is presence. The water at 41 degrees north latitude in the second week of April holds temperatures barely above freezing, 28 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the day. On the surface, in calm weather, this is not immediately apparent. The sea can look almost inviting, polished still, reflecting the stars on a clear night with a sharpness that seems impossible. Underneath that surface is something else entirely. A human being immersed in water at 28 degrees Fahrenheit will lose consciousness within approximately 15 minutes. In calm water, the cold enters through the skin and begins immediately to pull heat from the body's core. The muscles cramp, the breathing becomes ragged, the mind begins to slow. This is not a dramatic process, it is a quiet one. The body simply loses the capacity to maintain itself, and the mechanism stops. The passengers on Titanic did not know this in any precise way. Most of them had no reason to think about it. They were inside the ship, in warm and lit and comfortable spaces, eating dinner or reading or playing cards or sleeping. The water outside was abstract, a condition of the crossing rather than a presence. The ship was between them and it. On the evening of April 14th, the ship was approximately 400 miles south of Newfoundland, making steady progress toward New York. The crossing had been going well. There had been messages, several of them, transmitted by wireless from other ships about ice in the shipping lanes. This was not unusual for the time of year. Ice warnings were a regular feature of spring Atlantic crossings. The standard practice was to note them, acknowledge them to the bridge, and keep watch. The warnings that day were somewhat more numerous than usual. 5 separate ships had reported ice in the area through which Titanic was passing or intended to pass. The Coronia had reported bergs. The Baltic had reported large quantities of field ice. The America had reported 2 large icebergs. The Mesaba had sent a warning about a large concentration of ice directly in Titanic's path. A warning that, as far as can be determined, was never delivered to the bridge. The Californian had stopped entirely. Her captain, Stanley Lord, had decided that the ice ahead was too heavy to navigate safely at night, and had stopped his ship until morning. Before stopping, the Californian's wireless operator had attempted to transmit an ice warning to Titanic directly, at close range, with what was effectively a shout in wireless terms. Titanic's operator, Jack Phillips, had been occupied with a long queue of passenger messages waiting to be sent on to New York. The Californian signal had come in so strongly that it had interrupted his work, and he had replied, in the terse shorthand of wireless operators, "Shut up, I am busy." The Californian's operator closed his set and went to bed. There is a quality of stillness to the night of April 14th that the survivors described consistently, years and decades later. The sea was the calmest many of them had ever seen. There was no wind, there was no swell, the stars were extraordinarily bright. The kind of brightness you get only when there is no moon, and no cloud and no humidity, just dry cold air between the ship and the sky. The ocean reflected the stars so clearly that it was difficult to tell, looking out, where the water ended and the sky began. Frederick Fleet was in the crow's nest. He was a lookout, one of a pair stationed above the bridge in a metal basket at the top of the forward mast. His job was simple: watch the water ahead of the ship and report anything that required the bridge's attention. He had binoculars for this purpose on most ships. On Titanic, the binoculars were missing. They had been accidentally locked in a cabinet during a crew change in Southampton, and no replacement pair had been found. Fleet had complained about this. His complaint had been noted. Nothing had been done, so he watched with his naked eye. At 11:39 p.m. he saw something, a darkness in the water ahead, a shape that was slightly different from the shapes around it, darker than the sea, higher than the horizon. He waited one beat, the professional instinct that separates a false alarm from a real one, and then reached for the bell rope and struck it 3 times. 3 bells. Object ahead. He picked up the telephone to the bridge and waited for the answer. The officer who picked up asked, "What do you see?" Fleet said, "Iceberg." "Right ahead," the officer said. "Thank you." He hung up. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch, who had the watch, had already heard the bells. He gave the order, "Harder starboard," meaning turn the wheel to port, to swing the bow to the left, and he ordered the engine room to stop, then reverse. The ship began to turn. But the Titanic was 269 meters long and moving at approximately 22 knots. She had the momentum of 52,000 tons. The bow began to swing left. The seconds passed. Fleet and his companion in the crow's nest watched the iceberg approach and watched the bow begin to move and calculated in the way that a person instinctively calculates without being able to articulate the mathematics, whether it would be enough. It wasn't quite enough. The iceberg passed down the starboard side of the ship, the right side, the side that had been turning toward it as the bow swung away. The contact lasted approximately 10 seconds. The iceberg, or a submerged spur extending from it, scraped along the hull below the waterline, popping rivets in 5 separate watertight compartments, opening seams in the steel plates, letting in the North Atlantic in a series of tears and punctures and sprung fastenings that together amounted to something between 12 and 13 square feet of opening through which the sea now poured. On the bridge, Murdoch engaged the watertight door switches. The doors in the lower compartments began to close. If only 1 or 2 compartments in breached, the ship could have survived. The design called for 4 compartments to flood without loss of stability, but 5 were open to the sea. 5 compartments filling with cold black water, each ton of water pulling the bow downward by an increment so small as to be imperceptible, but adding up. Thomas Andrews was woken and brought to assess the damage. He went below with the captain, lantern in hand, moving through the spaces of the ship he had designed with a familiarity so complete it required no thought. He measured the flood rate, he estimated. He did the arithmetic in his head, methodically, because that was what he was trained to do. Then he told Captain Smith what he had found. The ship would sink in 2 hours, perhaps a little less, perhaps a little more, but she would sink. There was no doubt in his voice because there was no doubt in the numbers. He had designed her. He knew what she could hold. He knew what she couldn't. Smith listened. Then he gave the order to uncover the lifeboats. The lifeboats. This is where the story becomes something more complicated than a disaster, more than a failure of engineering or navigation or watchkeeping. It becomes a story about assumptions, about who, when the moment comes, is expected to be saved. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, 14 standard lifeboats, each capable of holding 65 people, 2 emergency cutters, 4 Engelhardt collapsible boats with canvas sides that could be raised. Total designed capacity 1,178 people. The ship was carrying 2,224 people. The regulations of the time required Titanic to carry enough lifeboats for 962 people. Titanic exceeded those regulations, which tells you something about the regulations. The regulations had been written when ships were smaller and had not been updated. The relevant body, the Board of Trade, had considered updating them. The consideration had not resulted in change. White Star had in fact considered adding additional lifeboats. The original design had included plans for up to 48 boats. The plans had been revised downward. The reason most often cited is deck space. Too many lifeboats would have crowded the promenade decks and made them less pleasant for first-class passengers. This explanation is debated by historians, but it is at minimum plausible, and what it reveals is a logic that feels very specific to its era. The comfort of the living taking precedence over provision for the dying, because no one expected the dying to be required. The Board of Trade had been satisfied. The naval architects had been satisfied. The owners had been satisfied. The inspectors who walked through the ship before departure had been satisfied. Everyone had been satisfied that the ship was, in all essential respects, ready. The loading of the lifeboats began just after midnight on April 15th. The ship's crew began waking passengers, gently at first, then with more urgency as the situation became clearer to those who understood it. The public rooms were still lit. The band, a group of 8 musicians employed by the ship and contracted to play for passenger entertainment, had assembled in the first-class lounge and was playing. They played ragtime at first, light, familiar tunes that suggested normalcy, that kept the temperature of the room below the threshold of panic. Many passengers did not want to get into the lifeboats. This seems improbable from the vantage of a century later, but it was entirely rational given the information available to them. The ship was bright and warm, and for the first hour after the collision barely seemed to be in motion downward. The night outside was bitterly cold. The sea looked vast and dark and inhospitable. The lifeboats were wooden and small, and required being lowered on ropes from a height of 60 feet to the water. The contrast between the lit warmth of the ship and the open darkness of the ocean was such that a reasonable person, told to choose between them, might well choose the ship. Crew members urged passengers into boats. Some passengers simply walked away. Some went below to their cabins to dress more warmly. Some went to find husbands or wives or children from whom they had been separated. Some stood at the rail and watched the stars. The first boats were launched badly underfilled. Lifeboat 7, the first to be lowered, left with 28 people when it could have held 65. Lifeboat 6 left with 28. Lifeboat 5 with 41. By the time the scale of the emergency was fully understood by the general population of the ship, the boats in the best positions were gone. Second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley, the science teacher from London, watched the loading with the attention he brought to everything. He was eventually guided toward a boat and told to get in. He got in. Later he would note that he felt no heroism in this, no particular choice or decision. He was simply told, and he went. He survived. Benjamin Guggenheim, at some point during the night, went below with his valet and changed out of his life vest and into his evening clothes. He returned to the first-class lounge and was found there by a steward who urged him to put the life vest back on. Guggenheim reportedly said, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Whatever one makes of this, and there is room for multiple interpretations, from genuine nobility to a kind of performance to simple paralysis dressed in the language of choice. The image is indelible. 2 men in evening clothes, sitting in a sinking ship, waiting for the end with their dignity intact. The sea was still flat. It remained, through the entire sinking, extraordinarily calm. There was no wave to wash people off the deck, no storm to confuse the evacuation. The conditions were as good as they could have been for survival, which meant they were still catastrophically insufficient. At 2:17 a.m, the lights went out. The engineers had stayed at their posts in the engine rooms until the end. Men whose names were not widely known then and are not widely known now. Men who had spent the last 2 hours keeping the electrical generators running so that the lights stayed on, and the wireless stayed active, and the pumps kept working, buying minutes, 1 minute at a time, until there were no more minutes to buy. They all died. Every single engineer and fireman who had stayed below to keep the power on died. Not one survived. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had been transmitting the CQD and then the SOS distress call continuously since midnight. Phillips kept sending until the water was around his knees. Bride survived by clinging to the bottom of an overturned collapsible boat in the freezing water. Phillips did not survive. The ship went vertical in its final minutes, the stern lifting out of the water as the bow dragged it down, the hull groaning and popping with sounds that survivors described as impossible to forget. The people still aboard, perhaps 1,500 of them, who had not made it into the boats or had jumped into the sea, were holding to railings, to each other, to anything fixed as the angle steepened. At 2:20 a.m. the Titanic sank. She went down in 2 pieces. The hull had broken between the 3rd and 4th funnels as the bow went under. A fact not fully established until Robert Ballard's expedition found the wreck in 1985, nearly a mile apart on the ocean floor, 3,800 meters below the surface. For over 70 years, the conventional account held that the ship had gone down in one piece. The wreck told a different story. The water temperature was 28 degrees. The 1,500 people in the water had approximately 15 minutes. From the lifeboats, rocking in the darkness, 200 or 400 meters away, the survivors could hear them. This is the detail that the survivors who wrote or spoke about it found hardest to revisit. Not the sight of the ship going under, not the darkness, the sound. The sound of 1,500 people in freezing water, calling for help. A sound described variously as a roar, a moan, a chorus, which slowly, over the course of 20 minutes, diminished. The lifeboats stayed where they were, mostly. There were complicated reasons for this. Fear of being swamped by desperate people swimming to the boat and pulling it over. Uncertainty about whether anyone was still alive. The cold and the shock and the particular human difficulty of acting decisively in the face of something too large to fully comprehend. Only one boat returned to search for survivors. Lifeboat 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who had the presence of mind and the courage to go back. He pulled 4 people from the water alive. He found many who were dead. The rest of the boats waited. At 4:10 a.m, the RMS Carpathia arrived. She had been 58 miles away when she received Titanic's distress call just before midnight. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, had immediately turned and pushed his ship to its maximum speed, and then somewhat beyond it, shutting off the heating to the passenger accommodation to direct all available steam to the engines, posting extra lookouts for ice, preparing his medical facilities and his crew for what was coming. Rostron was, by all accounts, a man who understood what the moment required. He had driven through the ice field in darkness at 14 knots. He could easily have struck a berg himself. He did not. The Carpathia reached the first lifeboats just after 4 in the morning. The survivors were hauled up the rope ladders or lifted in slings, those too weak or too cold to climb. The crew brought them blankets and hot soup and a kind of practical compassion that required no ceremony. Of the 2,224 people aboard Titanic, 710 survived, 1,514 did not. The Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of April 18th, 3 days after the sinking. The city was waiting. Thousands of people stood in the rain at Pier 54. Reporters and photographers and representatives of the major newspapers, and private citizens who had come simply because they needed to stand in the presence of what had happened. The White Star offices had spent those 3 days releasing information in fragments. The company's public communications during the crisis were confused and sometimes misleading. Caught between the genuine uncertainty of early reports and a perhaps understandable reluctance to confirm the scale of what had occurred. The survivor list had been transmitted by wireless. For families waiting in New York and London and Southampton, the list had been everything. The only way to know. Some names appeared on the list. Many did not. The not knowing was its own particular suffering. Suspended between hope and grief, unable to mourn properly, unable to stop hoping. When the Carpathia docked and the survivors came down the gangway, wrapped in borrowed clothes, many of them still in shock, some of them weeping, some of them simply silent. The photographs taken in that moment have a quality that is hard to describe, a kind of aftermath. The particular look of people who have been somewhere that other people haven't, and who are now trying to re-enter the ordinary world and finding it doesn't quite fit anymore. Molly Brown, characteristically, had organised the survivors on the Carpathia. She had raised money from the first-class passengers who had money for those who didn't. She had sat with people who needed company. She had made practical arrangements. She came off the ship purposeful, in motion, already thinking about the next thing to be done. Some others came off the ship and never really recovered. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star, who had been aboard and had got into a lifeboat while others were still on deck. There were conflicting accounts of the circumstances, and Ismay himself maintained he had helped load passengers into boats until there were no passengers near him and then stepped in. Spent the rest of his life largely in seclusion, bearing a weight of public condemnation that may or may not have been entirely deserved, but which he bore nonetheless. Ismay lived until 1937. He rarely spoke about the sinking. When he did, he said very little. The rain fell on Pier 54 for most of that evening. It was a light rain, the kind that doesn't quite decide to be rain, that hovers between mist and intention, that settles on cloth and hair without quite soaking through. The reporters who stood waiting for the Carpathia wore their coats buttoned to the neck. The photographers held their equipment under their arms. The private citizens, the ones who had come simply because they had to be somewhere near it, stood quietly in the wet, not speaking much, watching the ship come in through the grey dark of the harbour. There is a photograph taken on that pier on the evening of April 18th, 1912. It shows a woman, her name was never recorded, standing apart from the crowd, looking toward the ship. She is wearing good clothes, well made, the clothes of someone from the comfortable middle of society. Her face is turned slightly away from the camera, and in the quality of her posture, the particular stillness of it, neither collapsed nor rigidly controlled, you can read something that is difficult to name precisely. She is waiting. She has been waiting for 3 days, and she has not yet been told what she already knows. She is present in the archive for perhaps 1 second. A stranger lifted a camera and pressed a shutter, and she was caught, and then she stepped back into the flow of that night and was never identified. We don't know if the person she was waiting for survived. The days immediately after the sinking were, for the survivors, a study in displacement. Some were taken to hotels near the pier, paid for by White Star or by charitable organisations that mobilised quickly once the scale of the disaster was understood. Some were taken in by relatives or family friends who had come to meet them. Some simply walked into the city, dazed, in borrowed clothes, carrying nothing, because everything they owned was at the bottom of the Atlantic, and tried to find a telephone, a familiar face, a fixed point. The third-class survivors were largely directed to immigration processing facilities. Even in the immediate aftermath of a disaster of this scale, the machinery of immigration continued to operate. Men and women who had lost their luggage, their savings, their travel documents, their fellow passengers, were processed through the standard questions. Name, country of origin, occupation, how much money are you carrying? Do you have a relative in America? What is their address? Some of them had no answers. Some had answers but could not give them in English. Interpreters were brought in. There were among the third-class survivors people speaking Irish, Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian, Italian, Croatian, Arabic, Armenian, and other languages, and the processing continued, methodically, because the system did not have a setting for grief. Many of the third-class survivors had lost not only their possessions, but the people with whom they had been travelling. The Titanic had been full of families, of groups who had pooled resources and travelled together. Cousins, brothers, neighbours from the same village in Finland or the same street in Cork. When a family came aboard as a group and only one person survived, the survival had a particular quality to it. The shape of a life organised around relationships, and all those relationships suddenly absent. A woman named Bertha Watt had boarded in Southampton with her mother. Her mother survived. Bertha was 12 years old. She later described standing on the Carpathia, watching the lifeboats being searched for survivors and understanding, in the way that a child understands things before she has the language for them, that the searching was almost finished, and her mother was not going to be found. She was brought to Portland, Oregon, where relatives were waiting. She lived until 1993. She gave occasional interviews about the sinking over the decades, and was always described as a gentle, thoughtful woman who had made a full life, and was reluctant to reduce that life to the single night that defined her in other people's imaginations. Toward the end, she said, "I don't want to be the Titanic girl. I was that girl. But I was other things as well." The investigations began almost immediately. In America, a Senate subcommittee convened within days of the Carpathia's arrival. The hearings were chaired by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, a man who knew very little about ships or the sea, but who understood politics and public anger and the importance of being seen to act. He subpoenaed surviving officers and crew before they could return to Britain, which caused considerable irritation in London, where it was felt that an American politician with no maritime expertise had no business interrogating British seamen about British shipping practices. The British inquiry followed, chaired by Lord Mersey, formally constituted as a Board of Trade inquiry. It was more technically detailed than the American hearings, less theatrically charged, conducted in the manner of an institution that is investigating itself with the sincerity that institutions typically bring to such exercises. Both inquiries concluded, in broad terms, similar things. The speed had been too high for the ice conditions. The lookout had not been provided with binoculars. The wireless warnings had not been given sufficient weight. The lifeboat provision was inadequate. The loading of the lifeboats had been disorganized. And the evacuation procedures, the crew's knowledge of what to do and how to communicate it to passengers, had been insufficient. Both inquiries largely absolved Captain Smith on the grounds that he had been following practices standard to the industry. He had not acted recklessly by the standards of 1912. He had acted as captains typically acted on spring Atlantic crossings, which was itself the problem, but which was understood to be a systemic failing rather than an individual one. Bruce Ismay was a different matter. The American inquiry was harder on him than the British one. Senator Smith found his departure in a lifeboat while passengers were still aboard to be a failure of duty that transcended legal obligation, a failure of the moral responsibility that came with his position as chairman of the company. Ismay maintained throughout that he had helped evacuate passengers and had stepped into a lifeboat only when no more passengers were nearby. This account was plausible. It was supported by some witnesses, but it satisfied almost no one because the symbolic weight of the chairman surviving was simply too heavy to be shifted by a factual argument. The newspapers had already rendered their verdict. The newspapers of April and May 1912 are extraordinary documents. Not because they are accurate, many of them were not. In the first confusing days when reports were fragmentary and contradictory, when one wire service reported that the ship had been taken in tow and was heading for port safely, when another reported an unknown number of casualties. The inaccuracy is not what makes them interesting. What makes them interesting is the tone. The coverage is large. The front pages in London and New York and everywhere else are consumed by it. But the tone, this is what stands out, is not quite what we might expect from a century's distance. It is less outraged than mournful, less accusatory than bewildered. There is in the early coverage a quality of genuine incomprehension, not the performed incomprehension of modern media, but the real thing, the sense of a world genuinely puzzling over something that did not fit its categories. The Titanic was supposed to be proof of something. It was supposed to be evidence of what had been accomplished, of where progress had brought humanity. And it had sunk, taking 1,500 people with it on its first voyage in calm water on a clear night. The irony of this was almost too blunt to be received as irony. It had the quality of a parable, so neatly structured in its reversal that it seemed almost arranged. The religious press reached for this interpretation immediately. Sermons across Britain and America in the week following the sinking took up the theme of hubris, the arrogance of naming a ship Titanic, of calling it Unsinkable, though it should be noted that White Star had never officially described Titanic as unsinkable. The phrase entered public circulation through the press and stuck, partly because it was too useful a story not to tell. The ship's name and the claim of invincibility became attached to each other in the public imagination in a way that was difficult to separate afterward, and the religious commentary used this attachment to make a point about the dangers of human confidence in the face of divine order. The secular press was more measured. The engineering journals asked practical questions about watertight compartment design and lifeboat regulation. The financial press began immediately to consider liability. Who owed what to whom under the maritime law of which country? These were legitimate questions, and most of them were eventually resolved, though the resolution took years, and the amounts paid to the survivors and the families of the dead were, by any reasonable measure, insufficient. In Southampton, where so many of the crew had lived, the impact was concentrated and intense. The crew manifest was drawn from the city with unusual density. Many of the stewards and firemen and trimmers and cooks were Southampton men, some of them from the same streets. When the list of survivors came through, entire neighbourhoods discovered their losses at the same time. Streets where every other house had a man on the ship, and half of those men were gone. The White Star offices distributed a form letter to the families of lost crew members. It expressed condolences. It noted that the company would give due consideration to any claims submitted. It was, by most accounts, not a document that provided much comfort. A local newspaper in Southampton began collecting contributions for a crew relief fund within a week. The response from the public was substantial. People gave what they could. Some gave 5 shillings, some gave £5. A few wealthy benefactors gave hundreds. The money was real. The gesture behind it was also real, an acknowledgement that something had been broken that required repair, even if repair was not quite the right word. There are names among the dead that history has polished until they gleam. The heroic wireless operator, the stoic engineers, the musicians who played until the end. And there are names that history has largely left alone. Among those largely left alone, Joseph Hyman, a tailor from Leeds who had saved for 3 years for his third-class ticket to visit his brother in New York. He had never been outside England before. He was 34 years old and not married, and the reason he was going to New York was that he had a plan, a specific, practical plan involving his brother's contacts in the garment industry and a small amount of starting capital, and he was the kind of man who made plans and followed them. He did not survive. His brother received a telegram. What happened to the plan is not recorded. Among those largely left alone, Nedelka Petrov, who was listed in the manifest as travelling from Bulgaria, origin uncertain, destination New York, age listed as 18, she survived. She was brought through Ellis Island 4 days after the Carpathia docked. The immigration processing had been delayed out of consideration for the disaster, and entered the United States with nothing. She apparently had a contact in Manhattan, because she made her way there. The historical record picks her up briefly in a 1920 census in Brooklyn, listed as a seamstress, age given as 26, which would be consistent. Then she disappears again. These are ordinary people. Their stories are not unusual by the standards of 1912, a world in which ordinary people regularly experienced losses of this scale, in which the gap between a life continuing and a life ending was often a matter of small circumstances and moderate luck. What the Titanic did was concentrate these stories, compress them onto a single ship, on a single night, in conditions dramatic enough to attract and hold the world's attention. The individual losses were familiar, the scale was not. This is perhaps part of why the disaster has held such a grip on the imagination for so long. It presents ordinary human vulnerability at a scale that cannot be dismissed or looked away from, combined with a narrative architecture, the hubris of the builders, the calm of the night, the insufficient boats, the slow and terrible geometry of the sinking. that is so complete it barely requires interpretation. It interprets itself. In the month following the sinking, the regulatory landscape of the North Atlantic changed substantially. The recommendations of both inquiries were, for the most part, implemented with reasonable promptness. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboat capacity for every person aboard. The practice of maintaining wireless watch around the clock, rather than shutting the receiver down when the operator went to sleep, became mandatory. The North Atlantic shipping lanes were shifted further south in spring and summer to reduce the likelihood of ice encounters. An international ice patrol was established, funded jointly by the maritime nations whose ships used the northern routes, responsible for locating and tracking icebergs and transmitting that information to all vessels. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS as it came to be known, was negotiated and signed in 1914. It established minimum standards for ships' safety equipment, communication requirements, and evacuation procedures. It has been revised and updated many times since then, and remains in force today, still carrying the name that was first assembled in the aftermath of the Titanic. These changes were real. They were consequential. Ships have sailed the North Atlantic since 1912 with full lifeboat capacity, with continuous wireless watch, with ice information regularly updated and shared. Whether the specific convergence of failures that produced the Titanic disaster could recur under those conditions, most maritime historians would say it could not, or at least not in the same way. The impulse to find a meaning in the disaster, to extract from it something that justified the loss, was understandable. Regulatory reform was the most concrete expression of that impulse. Something had been learned, something had been changed. The 1,514 dead had at least purchased safety for those who came after. Whether this framing was adequate to the loss is a different question, and one that admits no comfortable answer. The world moved on, as the world does. 2 years after the sinking, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo pulled Europe into a war that would kill 37 million people and reshape the continent beyond recognition. The men who had debated lifeboat regulations and watertight compartment design in 1912 found themselves, by 1914, dealing with questions of an entirely different order. The Titanic receded, not from memory, but from the front of attention. There were new catastrophes. There were new losses of life on a scale that made even the Titanic seem, in the terrible arithmetic of wartime, manageable. Many of the Titanic survivors experienced the war. Men who had been pulled from the North Atlantic were sent to the Western Front. Women who had lost husbands to the sinking lost sons to the trenches. The threads of individual biography crossed in ways that are difficult to follow fully, because the records are incomplete and the scale of the disruption enormous, but the outlines are legible. Lawrence Beasley, the science teacher, survived the war. He continued to teach. He revised and republished his account of the sinking several times over the following decades, becoming one of the most reliable and frequently cited survivor witnesses. He lived until 1967, long enough to see the first serious films about the sinking, and long enough to be mildly appalled by what they had done to the story. He attended a press screening of one of the later productions and was asked what he thought. He said that it was not inaccurate exactly, but that it had turned something that was very large and very quiet into something small and loud. This is a distinction worth dwelling on. The Titanic became a film very quickly. The first dramatic film about the sinking was released in May 1912, within weeks of the disaster. It was a silent film, barely more than a sketch, made quickly to capitalize on the public's appetite for imagery that the photographs couldn't provide. Dorothy Gibson, an actress who had been aboard Titanic and survived, starred in it, wearing the same clothes she had been wearing the night of the sinking. The film was not subtle. It was not trying to be. It was nonetheless watched by very large numbers of people. The pattern this established, of the Titanic story being retold in popular form, each retelling reaching a new audience, each one shaped by the aesthetic and moral preoccupations of its moment, would continue throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. There were novels, there were stage productions, there were radio dramatizations. There were at least 5 major films before the 1997 James Cameron production. each one interpreting the material differently, each one finding in the same set of events a slightly different set of meanings. What is striking, reviewing these successive retellings, is how consistently certain elements persist. The band playing on the deck as the ship goes down, the insufficient lifeboats, the contrast between first-class comfort and third-class confinement. The captain going down with his ship, though the historical evidence for this is not conclusive. These elements function as the story's fixed points, the things that each retelling agrees on, the foundation on which each new interpretation builds. The elements that vary are equally revealing. In some versions, the villains are the ship's owners, driven by commercial greed. In others, they are the engineers who failed to build the ship strong enough, or the regulators who failed to require adequate lifeboats. In the Cold War era, some productions found in the class dynamics of the sinking a parable about economic systems. In later decades, individual heroism and individual love became more central. The disaster as a context for personal stories rather than a social critique. The 1997 film reached approximately 2 billion people. The music from it became one of the most globally recognized pieces of popular music of the late 20th century. The fictional love story at its center became, for many people, the primary emotional architecture through which the real events were understood. This is not a criticism of the film, it is simply an observation about what happens when a historical event is absorbed into popular culture at that scale. The fiction becomes, in some functional sense, more real than the history, because more people have experienced it. The survivors who were still alive in 1997 had by then lived so long with their story being retold that most of them had developed a kind of equanimity about it. They had given their accounts. They had been interviewed, photographed, incorporated into documentaries, quoted in books. They understood that the public's version of events and their own remembered version were not quite the same thing, and had made a kind of peace with this. The last living survivor of the Titanic was Milvina Dean, who had been 9 weeks old when the ship sank. She had been in third class with her mother, father, and older brother. Her father died. Her mother took the children back to England. Milvina Dean grew up in Southampton, worked as a civil servant, retired. She did not know she had been on the Titanic until she was 8 years old, when her mother told her. She gave her first public interview about the disaster in the 1980s and continued to speak about it occasionally for the rest of her life, with a wry and cheerful detachment that came from the simple fact of having been an infant at the time. She died in 2009 at the age of 97. The wreck was found on September 1st, 1985. Robert Ballard, an oceanographer with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, had been searching for the wreck in collaboration with a French research team. They had been using an unmanned sled equipped with cameras, towed slowly across the seabed at a depth of 3,800 meters, covering a grid pattern over the area of the most probable sinking location. The search had been going on for days. The team was tired. Just after midnight, the time is notable, given what had happened at that same approximate hour 73 years before. One of the cameras returned an image of a circular object on the seabed. Someone in the control room said, "Boiler," because that's what it was. One of Titanic's enormous boilers lying on the ocean floor. The debris field spread out ahead of them. They had found it. Ballard wrote later that the team's first reaction was not triumph. It was something quieter. They were standing in the middle of the night, on a research ship above the site of one of history's most famous disasters, and the reality of what lay below them, the thousands of objects spread across the seabed, the personal effects, the structural fragments, the place where 1,514 people had died, settled over the room like a weight. Someone began to speak. Someone else said, "Be quiet." They held a brief, improvised memorial service on the stern of the ship. Then they went back to work. The images Ballard's team returned were the first photographs of the wreck. They circulated around the world with a speed that 1985 still thought of as fast. The ship's bow, partly buried in sediment but recognizable. The anchors still in their housings. The railing still intact on the bow where lookouts had once stood, was a sight that stopped people. It made the wreck present in a way that no film or painting or description had quite achieved. There it was. It had been there all along, in the dark and the cold and the pressure, slowly being eaten by bacteria and time. The wreck sits at a depth where the pressure is approximately 380 atmospheres. There is no light. The temperature is just above freezing. The organisms that have colonized the iron over the decades, a type of bacteria that consumes iron, forming what are called rusticles, stalactite-like formations of rust that hang from the hull, have been slowly dissolving the ship for over a century. At the current rate of deterioration, structural sections of the hull are expected to collapse over the coming decades. The bow, which is in better condition than the stern, will eventually go as well. The wreck will not last forever. This seems appropriate, in a way. The ship was built to be temporary, to serve a purpose and be replaced by newer ships. That it has persisted this long in the imagination, and that the wreck has persisted this long on the ocean floor, are both facts that would have seemed extraordinary to the men who laid the keel in 1909. What the wreck revealed, beyond the structural information about how the ship broke apart, was the debris field, spread across approximately a square mile of seabed between the bow and the stern sections, are the personal effects of the people who were aboard. Shoes, thousands of them, often in pairs, because leather is more durable than the human tissue that once occupied them. Luggage, dishes, a child's toy, recovered and returned to the surface, now held in a museum. A leather wallet, its contents partially legible. Bottles of wine, still sealed, the contents theoretically drinkable though no one has tested this. A porcelain sink, intact. The iron frame of a bed. The objects resist easy narrative. They are too various, too specific, too accidental in their preservation. This bag survived. The one next to it did not. This shoe is here. The other shoe of the pair may be yards away, or may have been consumed. The randomness of what has been preserved is its own kind of record. Not of what was important, but of what happened to survive the particular chemistry and physics of the ocean floor. There have been significant debates about the ethics of recovering objects from the wreck. The United States courts, after complex litigation, granted control of the salvageable artifacts to a company called RMS Titanic, Inc., which has conducted multiple expeditions and recovered thousands of objects now held in museum collections. The legal framework governing the wreck is complicated by the fact that it lies in international waters, that the various nations whose citizens died aboard have different legal interests, and that the competing claims of commercial salvage, scientific research, family sentiment, and public heritage do not resolve neatly. Some of the survivors' families have argued that the wreck should be treated as a grave site, left undisturbed, allowed to complete its dissolution in peace. Others have argued that the scientific and historical value of the objects recovered outweighs this concern, particularly given that the wreck is deteriorating, regardless of whether objects are removed. The debate has not been resolved and will probably not be resolved to everyone's satisfaction, because the values in tension are genuinely incompatible. Ballard himself has consistently argued for leaving the wreck alone, beyond what has already been removed. He has proposed installing cameras and lighting systems that would allow the wreck to be observed remotely without physical disturbance. This proposal has not been adopted. The sea has been doing its quiet work on the wreck for over a century now. It is doing it still in the dark and the pressure and the cold, while above it the world goes about its business. Ships cross the Atlantic every day, carrying passengers, carrying cargo, crossing the same approximate area of ocean where Titanic went down. They cross it faster now, and their safety systems are more sophisticated, and the ice warnings are more reliable, and there are enough lifeboats. The people aboard them eat their meals and sleep in their cabins and look out at the water, which looks the same as it has always looked. Flat or rough depending on the weather, grey or blue depending on the light, enormously itself. The distance between the surface and the wreck is 3,800 metres. To put that in terms the body can understand, it is nearly 4 kilometres straight down. If you fell from the deck of a ship, you would sink for perhaps 20 minutes before reaching the bottom, assuming the pressure didn't affect the body before that. The wreck is beyond the reach of daylight entirely. Below approximately 200 metres, the ocean is dark in a way that the word dark doesn't quite capture. It is the absence not only of light, but of the expectation of light, a darkness so complete and so old that it has its own quality. Down there, in that dark and that pressure, The Titanic lies in two pieces, slowly being eaten, slowly dissolving, the rusticles growing and falling and growing again, the objects in the debris field shifting minutely in the deep water currents. The grand staircase that Thomas Andrews drew in careful pencil lines, that passengers wrote about with reverence, is long gone, the wood consumed in the first decades after the sinking. What remains is the iron frame around where it stood, the shape of the space without the content. But the boilers are intact, the anchors are in their housings. The railing at the bow is still standing, where the lookouts once stood in the dark of April 14th and watched the horizon for things that shouldn't be there. There is a question that the Titanic invites, and that I want to approach carefully, because it is easy to answer it badly. The question is, what does it mean? Not what lessons should we draw. The lessons are clear enough, and most of them were implemented before the bodies were cold. Not what went wrong. The inquiries established that with reasonable thoroughness. But what does the story mean as a story, as something that the human imagination has returned to obsessively for over a century? Part of the answer is simply scale. 1,514 deaths in one night in peacetime, in calm water, on what was supposed to be the safest ship ever built. The sheer number, combined with the circumstances, produces a kind of significance that smaller disasters don't achieve, however individually terrible they might be. But scale alone doesn't explain the persistence. Other disasters of comparable or greater scale have been largely forgotten by the general public. The Titanic remains. Part of what keeps it present, I think, is the completeness of the story. It has a beginning, the ambition, the construction, the launch. It has a middle, the voyage, the night, the specific and almost unbelievably clear sequence of decisions and failures. It has an end, the sinking, the survival, the aftermath. And it has characters who are vivid enough to be remembered. The wireless operator who said shut up and kept sending to the last. The musicians who played on the deck. The man who changed into his evening clothes. The woman from Colorado who organized the lifeboats. The ship's designer who walked the flooding corridors of the thing he had built and understood, before anyone else, that it was going to kill him. These are figures who function almost like archetypes. The professional who does his duty past the point of reason. The wealthy man who meets death with an absurd dignity. The practical woman who simply acts. The builder who cannot save his creation. They are recognizable. They are the kinds of people we know, or think we know, or hope we might be in extremity. And underneath all of it, underneath the drama and the loss and the regulatory reform and the litigation and the films, there is something simpler, something that doesn't require interpretation. There was a ship. It was the most magnificent thing of its kind ever built. It was full of people, rich people and poor people, people with plans and people without plans, people who were afraid and people who weren't, people who had names that history would remember, and people who had names that history would not. And it sank, in the dark, in very cold water, and most of them died. That's the story. In its most reduced form, that's all it is. The rest is what we make of it. Esther's postcard. The young woman from Cork who wrote home on the morning of April 11th, saying the ship was the most enormous thing she had ever seen in her life, that the sea was very blue and very calm, that she had eaten a meal with a white tablecloths, and that it felt like something belonging to another person's life. She was not famous. She did not do anything notable during the sinking, as far as anyone can determine. The postcard that was found in the tin was eventually matched to a passenger list entry, a name, an age, a point of origin, a destination. The passenger list indicates she did not survive, but she wrote the postcard. She stood at the stern of the ship on a clear spring morning and watched the Irish coastline disappear and felt the strangeness of it and reached for paper and pencil and tried to say what it was. Like, she said it was enormous. She said she was not afraid. These two things, the enormousness and the absence of fear, are the record she left. A few lines in pencil, sealed by chance in a tin for 75 years, found by a diver from a research submersible on the seabed of the North Atlantic, 3 miles below the surface. The postcard exists. Her words are readable. She wrote them 4 days before she died, eating a meal with a white tablecloth, somewhere in the middle of the ocean, not afraid. The stars above the North Atlantic, on a clear April night, are extraordinarily numerous. Sailors have known this for centuries. The North Atlantic sky, unobstructed by city light, in the cold dry air of spring, offers a view of the galaxy that most people on land never see. The constellations are where you expect them. The Milky Way is a smear of light so dense it looks almost solid. The individual stars, seen without the distortion of atmosphere that accumulates over populated land, are points so sharp they seem almost close enough to touch. Frederick Fleet saw those stars from the crow's nest before he saw the iceberg. He had been standing in the cold for hours, watching, in the way that a person watches who has been trained to watch, alert but not tensed, not straining, simply present, his eyes moving across the horizon in the regular pattern that experience had made automatic. He saw the iceberg. He struck the bell. He picked up the telephone. Then he watched what happened. He survived. He was in a lifeboat when the ship went down. He testified at both inquiries, answered questions about the missing binoculars and the conditions of visibility and the time between his warning and the collision. He answered carefully. He did not exaggerate or dramatize. After the inquiries, he went back to sea. He worked on ships for several more years, then retired from the sea and worked on shore in various capacities. He became a newspaper seller eventually in Southampton. He was still alive in 1959 when James Cameron's predecessor, a British film called A Night to Remember, was released to wide acclaim. Fleet saw the film. He was asked what he thought. He didn't say much. He rarely did. He died in 1965 at the age of 76. He had outlived many of the people he had tried to save. On the ocean floor, the rusticles continue their quiet work. The bow is settling further into the sediment year by year. The prow, the very tip, the point that struck the water at Southampton Harbour for the first time on May 31st, 1911, and that cut the Atlantic for 4 days and then hit ice on the 5th, is buried. The anchors remain. The spare anchor, which was never used, is still in its davit on the bow deck. The debris fill holds what it holds. The shoes, the bottles, the luggage frames, the dishes. Somewhere in it, almost certainly, is the tin that held Esther's postcard, returned to the site where it was found, or perhaps carried further by currents, or perhaps simply lying where it was and covered now by the ongoing fall of particles that researchers call marine snow, the slow downward drift of organic matter from the surface, covering everything in a fine, continuous settling. The cold is absolute, the dark is complete. The Titanic has been down there for longer now than it was above it. The ship was launched in 1911 and sank in 1912, 15 months of existence. It has been on the seabed for over a century. In geological time, this is nothing. In human time, it is enough for the children of survivors to have grown old and died, for the world that built the ship to have been replaced by several subsequent worlds, for the name Titanic to have accumulated meanings that its builders, naming it for the primordial giants of Greek mythology, could not possibly have anticipated. The ship was a dream. It was a very specific kind of dream. The dream that human ingenuity, given enough capital and enough time, could build its way past the old vulnerabilities, could create spaces so complete and so controlled that the world outside those spaces would cease to matter. The ocean, in this dream, was simply the medium of transit, a nuisance to be managed, a distance to be crossed, a problem that engineering had largely solved. The ocean did not share this assessment. It never has. It is not, in any meaningful sense, hostile. It is simply itself, following physical laws that have nothing to do with human intention or human ambition or human need. The ice that was in the shipping lanes that April was there because ice is always in those lanes in April. The calm water that made the night so beautiful was the same calm water that left the iceberg undetected until it was too late. The cold that killed 1,514 people in the space of 2 hours was simply the temperature of the water at 41 degrees north latitude in the second week of April. None of it was aimed at the Titanic. None of it knew the Titanic existed. This is perhaps the hardest thing to hold. Not that something malevolent destroyed the ship, but that nothing did. That the universe does not arrange itself around human projects, however magnificent, however carefully planned, however confidently named. The engineers knew this, in the abstract. Thomas Andrews knew it. He had designed watertight compartments precisely because he knew the ocean could come in. He had simply not designed for quite this much of it, quite this fast, in quite this configuration. After Andrews had calculated the flooding rate and told the captain the ship would sink, he was seen moving through the first-class sections of the ship, helping where he could, urging passengers toward the boats. A steward who survived reported seeing him in the first-class smoking room late in the sinking, standing at the fireplace and staring into it. His life jacket was off. He was alone. The steward spoke to him. Andrews didn't reply. He had been through the ship. He had done what he could. He was standing in the space of the thing he had made, in the last hour of its existence, and whatever he was thinking in that moment is not recorded and perhaps not imaginable. He did not survive. The world of 1912, the confident, industrious, optimistic world that built the Titanic, was itself already closer to its end than it knew. The war that came 2 years later killed not only tens of millions of people, but something less tangible, the particular certainty that had characterized the Edwardian and late Victorian mind. The belief that progress was reliable, that science and engineering and commerce were steadily solving the problems of human existence, that the future would be recognizably better than the past, and would arrive on a schedule. The war complicated that belief beyond repair, not destroyed it. Belief in progress is difficult to destroy entirely, but complicated it, introduced qualifications that have never quite been removed. The same engineering that built the Titanic built the guns that killed millions in the trenches. The same industrial capacity, the same materials, the same understanding of metals and pressure and force. Human capability, it turned out, was not inherently pointed toward the good. It was pointed wherever it was aimed. This is a lesson the Titanic had also offered, in a smaller and more specific way. The capability that built the ship, real, extraordinary, admirable capability, had been aimed partly at excess. The Turkish bath in the middle of the ocean, the electric camel, the 17 pieces of luggage. These were the products of a society that had accumulated enough surplus to indulge itself without particularly examining the indulgence. The ship was magnificent, and the magnificence had a cost, and the cost was paid by the people who hadn't been able to afford a cabin on the upper decks. This is not a simple moral. The third-class passengers had chosen to be on the ship, and they had chosen it partly because the ship genuinely offered them something valuable: faster passage to a new life, better conditions than earlier vessels, food they hadn't had at home. The relationship between the luxury at the top and the vulnerability at the bottom was not simple exploitation. It was something more complicated, a structure that served everyone, while serving some more than others, whose failures were distributed according to the same logic as its benefits. This, too, is a lesson that didn't end in 1912. It was still being learned. It is still being learned. There is a moment in the last minutes of the sinking that has been described by several survivors, independently, and that I find myself returning to. As the stern rose and the ship's angle steepened, and the remaining passengers on deck found themselves holding to rails and fixtures to keep from sliding, the lights, which had been burning throughout the sinking, maintained by the engineers below, flickered once and then went out. The ship went dark. In the dark, someone began to sing. It was not an organized thing. It was one voice, then a few others, then more. The hymn that was sung, or what survivors believed was sung, memory being uncertain in extremity, was described variously. Some said it was "Nearer, my God, to Thee." Others said it was another hymn entirely. The band, or some of the band, may have been playing. Or the band had stopped and individual passengers had begun singing spontaneously, filling the silence. It is impossible to know exactly what happened in those final 2 or 3 minutes, in the dark, with the ship rising nearly vertical and the cold Atlantic rising to meet it. The accounts that exist were gathered from people who were in lifeboats at some distance, in the dark. They heard something. What they heard was filtered through terror and shock and the physical noise of a ship breaking apart. But they heard it, multiple witnesses independently. Something was sung. On a ship going down, in the dark, in very cold water, people sang. Whatever the theology of it, whatever the individual belief that prompted the voice that started it, there is something in the act itself that seems important. Not the words, or the tune, or the tradition it came from. The act. People facing the end of everything, in a darkness so complete it had no orientation, and choosing to make sound together. Human beings do this. In the face of the incomprehensible, we reach for each other. We sing, we hold on, We try to be present to the moment, whatever the moment holds. This is perhaps the one lesson the Titanic offers that doesn't require regulatory implementation or engineering revision or political reform. It is simply what was observed. At the end, when the ship was going and the night was cold and the stars were still burning above with complete indifference, people held on to each other and made sound. It didn't save them. It doesn't need to have saved them to matter. The ocean above the wreck is moving right now, as it has always moved. The surface, wherever the weather is today, perhaps calm, perhaps rough, perhaps somewhere between, is catching whatever light falls on it and doing what water does with light, fragmenting it, multiplying it, letting it go. Somewhere in the general area of 41 degrees north and 49 degrees west, the water is deep and cold and going about its enormous business, as it was doing on the evening of April 10th when Titanic steamed out of Southampton, and on the night of April 14th when the ice came, and on every day and night of the 113 years since. The ship is down there. It will be down there, in one form or another, for a long time yet. Long after the wood is gone, and the glass is gone, and the decks have collapsed, and the hull has dissolved to a stain on the sediment. Long after anyone who remembers any survivor is also gone, the iron will have dispersed into the ecosystem of the deep ocean. The rusticles will have finished their work. The seabed will have slowly absorbed what was once the most magnificent ship ever built. And even then, the story will probably persist. Some stories become part of the common inheritance of the species, not because they are unique, but because they concentrate in a single event something that is universal. Ambition, confidence, catastrophe, loss, the gap between what we build and what we control, the dignity of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, the particular human impulse, in the face of darkness, to reach for each other and make some kind of sound. The Titanic is one of those stories. It went down at 2:20 in the morning of April 15th, 1912, in calm water, in the dark, in the cold. The sea closed over it. The stars were still burning. Somewhere in a lifeboat, someone was counting the people around them, and the count was never going to be right. Somewhere on the seabed, 3 miles below, a tin was settling into the sediment, sealed against the water, carrying a few lines written in pencil by a young woman who said she was not afraid. The Carpathia was coming. It was still an hour away, but it was coming, and it found them, and 710 people lived and carried the story forward and gave it to their children and their grandchildren, and to the people who wrote books and made films and asked questions and refused to let the thing be simply over. Because it isn't simply over. It is still happening, in the way that things of this weight always continue to happen, not in time, but in the imagination, in the quiet moment before sleep, when the mind lets go of the day and reaches, sometimes, for the long stories, the old losses, the human shapes moving through history in the dark. The ship is there, the water is cold, the stars are out, rest now.